There's only one room available. A surprising encounter between an executive and a beautiful stranger. Hello. Let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. Lightning split the Chicago sky as Ethan Carter stood at the airport terminal window, watching his chances of reaching New York disappear with each cancelled flight announcement. His reflection stared back at him, tall, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary, and wearing an expression that had made countless boardroom opponents fold. Tonight, however, that expression wasn't helping him control the weather. Flight 2847 to New York LaGuardia has been cancelled due to severe weather conditions. The announcement crackled through the speakers, confirming what he already knew. He didn't bother joining the crowd of passengers rushing toward the customer service desk. Instead, he pulled out his phone, fingers moving swiftly across the screen as he searched for available hotels. The first 5 were fully booked. On the 6th try, the Greystone Hotel had 1 room left. Ethan booked it immediately, then called his driver. "James, change of plans. Take me to the Greystone." The rain was falling in sheets when the black Lincoln pulled up to the hotel's entrance. Ethan strode through the ornate lobby, briefcase in hand, conscious of the water dripping from his wool coat onto the marble floor. The elderly clerk behind the desk looked up as he approached, her nameplate reading Dorothy. "Reservation for Carter," he said, already reaching for his wallet. Dorothy's fingers moved across her keyboard, her expression shifting from professional to concerned. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Carter, but it seems we have a situation. That room has been double booked." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I just reserved it 20 minutes ago." "Yes, sir. Our system experienced a glitch during the storm. The room was simultaneously booked by another guest who has already checked in." Dorothy's voice carried genuine regret. "Given the weather, all other hotels in the area are likely full as well." Before Ethan could respond, the elevator doors opened and a woman stepped out. She moved with a photographer's eye, taking in the lobby's details as if framing shots. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and despite her casual attire, jeans and oversized sweater, she carried herself with a guarded grace that caught his attention. "Ms. Brooks," Dorothy called out. "Could you come here for a moment?" The woman approached cautiously, her arms crossed. Up close, Ethan noticed the shadows under her eyes and the way she positioned herself, keeping the desk between them. "This is Mr. Carter," Dorothy explained. "Due to a computer error, he was able to book the same room you're in. With the storm, there are no other rooms available in the hotel or likely anywhere nearby." Sophia Brooks's green eyes met Ethan's, wariness evident in her gaze. "I'm not sharing my room with a stranger." "I understand your concern," Ethan said, his voice carrying the same tone he used to close million-dollar deals. "I'm happy to sleep in the lobby." Dorothy shook her head. "I'm afraid hotel policy prohibits that. Either you share the room, or one of you will need to leave." She glanced meaningfully at the windows, where lightning illuminated sheets of rain and wind-whipped trees. Sophia's fingers tightened around her arms. "The room has 2 beds." "Yes," Dorothy confirmed, "and it's our largest standard room." Ethan watched as Sophia wrestled with the decision, noting how she glanced between him, Dorothy, and the storm outside. He recognized the calculations happening behind her eyes, weighing risks, considering options, looking for threats. It was the same thing he did before every major business decision, though he suspected her stakes were more personal than financial. "Fine," Sophia finally said, her voice tight. "But I have conditions." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but nodded. "Name them. We stay on opposite sides of the room. You don't ask personal questions. And if you make me uncomfortable in any way, you leave, storm or no storm." Each word was crisp, definitive. "Agreed," he said, reaching for his credit card. "I'll pay for the room." "No." Sophia's response was immediate. "We split it equally. I don't need favors from strangers." For a moment, Ethan saw something familiar in her stance, the fierce independence of someone who'd learned the hard way that help often came with hidden costs. He wordlessly put his card away and waited as Dorothy processed their separate payments. As they walked to the elevator, maintaining a careful distance from each other, thunder rattled the windows. The storm that had grounded his flight and disrupted his carefully controlled life was gathering strength. Watching Sophia press the button for the 8th floor, her movements precise and defensive, Ethan had the unsettling feeling that this wasn't the only storm he'd have to weather tonight. Neither of them spoke as the elevator climbed. The silence filled with unasked questions and unspoken boundaries. They were two strangers forced together by circumstance, each carrying their own weather systems of secrets and scars, and somehow they had to make it through the night. The room key card beeped green, and Sophia pushed the door open with practiced caution. She'd chosen the far bed before Ethan even stepped inside, dropping her camera bag on it like a territorial marker. The room was larger than she'd expected. 2 queen beds separated by a substantial nightstand, a desk by the window, and a small sitting area near the door. Ethan followed her in, his expensive shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. Without a word, he placed his briefcase on the desk and began unpacking his laptop. The routine seemed reflexive, as if his body was operating on autopilot while his mind worked on bigger problems. "I need to make some calls," he said, not looking up from his screen. "I'll use the bathroom." "Wait." Sophia's voice was firm. "I need to use it first." He paused, finally looking at her. Their eyes met in a brief clash of wills before he nodded, gesturing for her to go ahead. Sophia grabbed her small overnight bag and slipped into the bathroom, fighting the urge to barricade the door. Old habits died hard. Inside, she splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection. "Just one night," she whispered to herself. "You've survived worse." Her hand instinctively went to her phone, checking again that her location sharing was disabled. Robert couldn't track her here. She was safe, for now. When she emerged, Ethan had removed his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing expensive cufflinks that caught the light. He was standing by the window, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in low, authoritative tones. "The Morrison deal closes tomorrow, with or without the environmental impact report," he was saying. "Their concerns are negligible compared to the potential returns." A pause. "Then find someone who will sign off on it. That's what we pay consultants for." Sophia's stomach clenched. She recognized that tone, the casual disregard for consequences, the assumption that money could solve any problem. She'd heard it too many times from Robert, usually right before he destroyed someone's life. Thunder crashed outside, and the lights flickered. Ethan glanced up at the ceiling, irritation crossing his features. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone. "Make it happen." "Charming," Sophia muttered, unable to help herself. "Do you always bulldoze through other people's concerns?" Ethan turned, his expression cooling. "I thought we agreed to no personal questions." "That wasn't a question. It was an observation." She moved to her bed, creating distance between them. "And destroying the environment isn't personal. It's everyone's problem." "You don't know anything about the deal or the company," he replied, his voice carrying that same boardroom authority that probably intimidated his employees. "And I'm not interested in debating business ethics with a stranger." Lightning illuminated the room, casting harsh shadows across his face. For a moment, Sophia saw something familiar in his expression. Not cruelty like Robert's, but a deep-seated pain masked by control. It made her even warier. "Fine by me," she said, pulling out her laptop. She had photos to edit anyway. Her real escape route. Each image she sold brought her closer to financial independence, closer to a life where she wouldn't need to share rooms with strange men during storms. The next hour passed in tense silence, broken only by the storm and the sound of their typing. Sophia lost herself in her work, adjusting light levels and contrast on a series of nature shots she'd taken in Wisconsin. Each photo captured something broken but beautiful. A fallen tree sprouting new growth, a cracked boulder with wildflowers growing through it, a damaged bird's nest carefully rebuilt. "Those are good," She startled at Ethan's voice, looking up to find him watching her screen. She hadn't heard him move closer, and her heart rate spiked. "Thanks," she said curtly, angling the screen away. "Sorry," he said, stepping back immediately. Something in his movement suggested he'd recognized her fear, and for a fraction of a second, his mask slipped. "I didn't mean to intrude. I used to know someone who took photos like that. Finding beauty in broken things." The raw note in his voice caught her off guard. Before she could respond, the lights flickered again and went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Sophia's laptop screen provided the only illumination, casting an eerie glow across their faces. "Perfect," Ethan muttered, reaching for his phone. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and he moved toward the room phone. "I'll call the front desk." Sophia sat perfectly still, trying to control her breathing. Darkness brought back memories she'd rather forget, hiding in closets, running down unlit streets, learning that monsters were real and wore expensive watches just like Ethan's. "They say the backup generator should kick in soon," Ethan reported, hanging up the phone. He must have noticed her tension because his voice softened slightly. Do you need the flashlight?" "I'm fine," she said automatically, the word tasting like a lie. But she'd learned long ago not to show weakness to men like him. Men who could buy and sell other people's futures over phone calls. Men who thought they could control everything. The backup lights hummed to life, casting a dim glow across the room. In that moment, as relief flooded through her, Sophia caught Ethan watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Understanding. Concern, whatever it was, it made her feel exposed, seen in a way she hadn't been in years. She turned back to her laptop, but the images on her screen suddenly felt too raw, too revealing. In trying to capture other broken things healing, she'd unknowingly been documenting her own story. And now she was sharing a room with a man who seemed to be carrying his own carefully hidden fractures. The storm raged on outside, but the real turbulence was in the fault lines running between them. Lines that were starting to feel less like boundaries and more like bridges. Neither of them was ready to cross. The digital clock on the nightstand blinked 11:47 p.m. when Ethan's phone rang again. He glanced at the screen, his jaw tightening imperceptibly before declining the call. It was the third time in the past hour he'd ignored that particular number. Sophia noticed the pattern from behind her laptop screen. She'd grown hyper-aware of patterns during her years with Robert, the way his voice would shift before an explosion, how his fingers would drum against surfaces when his patience wore thin. But Ethan's patterns were different. Each ignored call seemed to add weight to his shoulders, like stones being added to a drowning man's pockets. The room service they'd ordered earlier sat half-eaten on the desk, her sandwich barely touched, his club sandwich methodically consumed in neat, measured bites. Even the way he ate spoke of control, of careful boundaries maintained. A particularly violent thunderclap rattled the windows, making them both jump. Sophia's laptop slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the bed. The sound triggered something in her memory. Breaking glass, screaming, the crash of a table being overturned. Her breath caught in her throat. "Are you all right?" Ethan's voice cut through her flashback. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression that wasn't quite concern, but wasn't indifference either. "Fine," she managed, but her hands were shaking as she checked her laptop for damage. "I just don't like loud noises." He nodded slowly, and something in his silence felt like recognition. "My brother was the same way," he said quietly, almost to himself. "After our father." He stopped abruptly, as if catching himself sharing too much, but those few words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. "You don't talk to him anymore?" Sophia surprised herself by asking, so much for no personal questions. Ethan moved to the window, his reflection overlaying the storm beyond. "We haven't spoken in 5 years. His voice carried the weight of corporate mergers and destroyed relationships. "Some mistakes can't be undone." "All mistakes can be undone," Sophia found herself saying. "It's just a question of whether we're brave enough to try." She wasn't sure if she was talking to him or herself. He turned from the window, studying her with those penetrating eyes. "Is that what you're doing here? Undoing a mistake?" The question hit too close to home. Sophia felt her walls rising again, but something made her hesitate before shutting down completely. Maybe it was the lateness of the hour, or the strange intimacy forced upon them by the storm, or the way his own carefully maintained facade had cracked when mentioning his brother. "I'm not undoing a mistake," she said finally. "I'm preventing one." She closed her laptop, plunging her side of the room into shadow. "Sometimes running away is the bravest thing you can do. Running away is what cowards do," Ethan responded, but his voice lacked conviction. It sounded more like he was quoting someone, perhaps the same someone who had taught him to wear success like armor. "No," Sophia countered, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Cowards stay. They stay in situations that kill them slowly because they're too afraid to face the unknown. They stay in towers they've built, surrounded by walls of money and power, because they're terrified of what might happen if they step outside." The words hung between them like lightning, illuminating truths neither had meant to expose. Ethan's phone rang again, that same ignored number, and this time Sophia saw his hand tremble slightly before he declined the call. Your brother?" she asked softly. "My father's lawyers." His voice was flat, but she caught the slight flinch around his eyes. "He's dying. Cancer. They want me to come to the reading of the will." "And your brother?" "Doesn't know. I made sure he was protected from all of this, the company, the inheritance, the responsibility. I thought I was—" He trailed off, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time since she'd met him. "I thought I was protecting him by deciding what he needed protection from." The words came out sharper than she intended, colored by her own experiences with men who thought they knew what was best for her. Ethan's gaze snapped to her face, recognition flickering in his eyes. For a moment, she saw her own pain reflected there, the pain of someone who had confused control with care, who had built walls so high they'd become a prison. "You sound like you're speaking from experience," he said quietly. Sophia stood abruptly, needing to move, to dispel the dangerous intimacy that had crept into their conversation. "I need some air." She headed for the door, but Ethan's voice stopped her. "It's past midnight. The roof garden is locked." Of course he would know her destination without asking. They were both used to seeking high places, she to photograph the world from a safe distance, he to survey his corporate kingdom. "I have a key," she said, pulling it from her pocket. At his questioning look, she added, "Dorothy gave it to me earlier. She said sometimes people need a quiet place to think." She hesitated at the door, surprising herself by asking, "Would you like to come?" The invitation hung in the air between them, fragile as a soap bubble. For a moment, she saw uncertainty crack through his corporate facade. The little boy who'd tried to protect his brother, the man who'd built an empire to prove something to a dying father. His phone rang again, the sound harsh in the midnight quiet. This time, he turned it off completely. "Yes," he said simply, "I would." The service elevator creaked as it carried them to the top floor. Sophia stood in one corner, Ethan in the other, both pretending not to notice how the small space amplified their awareness of each other. The rain drummed against the elevator shaft, a constant reminder of the storm that had forced them together. The key Dorothy had given her worked smoothly in the lock. As they stepped onto the rooftop garden, the wind whipped at their clothes, but the rain had temporarily subsided. Chicago spread out before them, a glittering maze of lights and shadows, while clouds churned overhead like troubled thoughts. "I come to places like this to shoot sometimes," Sophia said, moving toward the railing. "Cities look different from above, more honest somehow." Ethan joined her, leaving a careful distance between them. His tie whipped in the wind. He hadn't bothered to remove it despite the hour. "Honest isn't the word I'd use," he replied. "From up here, you can't see the mess, the complications. It all looks manageable. That's why you like your corner office on the 42nd floor." The words came out before she could stop them. He glanced at her sharply. "How did you—" "I Googled you while you were in the bathroom earlier," she admitted. Ethan Carter, CEO of Carter Industries, youngest Fortune 500 CEO in Chicago's history. She paused, watching his reaction. Your company's logo is on half the construction sites downtown. And what else did your research tell you? His voice was carefully neutral, but she caught the tension in his shoulders. That you donated $10 million to children's charities last year. She turned to face him fully. But none to domestic violence shelters or environmental causes. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating his face as he processed her words. You're running from domestic violence, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Sophia's fingers tightened on the railing. His name is Robert Maxwell. He's on the board of 3 major banks and chairs 2 charitable foundations. He's known for his generous donations to the arts. Her voice turned bitter. And everyone loves him. He makes sure of it. How long? 3 years. It started small, checking my phone, questioning my friends, suggesting I quit my freelance work because he could take care of me. She took a shaky breath. By the time he broke my wrist, I'd already lost touch with everyone who might have helped. Ethan's hand moved slightly toward hers on the railing before stopping. But you got out. I got smart, she corrected. And started documenting everything, built a secret account, made copies of his financial records when she swallowed hard, when he was occupied with hurting me. The night he found my go-bag, I ran. That was 2 months ago. He's still looking. I could help, Ethan offered, his business instincts kicking in. My lawyers. No, Sophia cut him off. I don't need another powerful man trying to solve my problems. That's not why I told you. Then why did you? She was quiet for a long moment, watching the city lights blur through unshed tears. Because you look at this city the same way he does, like it's something to be conquered. And because you're hurting your brother the same way you think you're protecting him. Ethan stepped back from the railing as if she'd struck him. You don't know anything about my brother. I know you're hiding something from him. Something about your father. She turned to face him. And I know what it's like when someone decides they know what's best for you without asking. Our father was a monster, Ethan said, his voice raw. Not like your Robert, but the kind that destroys you with disappointment, with impossible standards. Nothing was ever enough. His hands clenched into fists. Adam was different, sensitive, creative. Dad would have crushed him. So you took the crushing instead. I built an empire, he corrected, but his voice lacked conviction. I became everything our father wanted, and I made sure Adam got away. Art school, a life away from all of this. He gestured at the city below. I send him money through a trust. He thinks it's from our mother's inheritance. But now your father's dying, Sophia said softly. And the truth is going to come out whether you want it to or not. Thunder rolled overhead, closer now. A few drops of rain began to fall, but neither of them moved. Adam has a gallery showing next month, Ethan said, so quietly she almost missed it. In New York, that's where I was flying to tonight, not for business. I go to all of them, but he doesn't know. I stand in the back. Watch him succeed on his own terms. That's not protection, Sophia said gently. That's punishment. You're punishing yourself for a choice you made when you were too young to know better. Ethan turned to her, rain running down his face, or perhaps they were tears. Like you're punishing yourself by running instead of fighting. The words hit her like a physical blow. Now that's different. Is it? He stepped closer, and for the first time she didn't feel the urge to back away. You're stronger than you think, Sophia. I saw it the moment you laid down your rules in the lobby. Robert didn't break you. He just made you forget who you are. The rain was falling steadily now, soaking through their clothes, but neither moved. They stood facing each other on the roof, 2 broken people recognizing their own pain in each other's eyes. Your brother needs his brother, Sophia said finally. Not his protector, not his secret guardian angel, just his brother. And what do you need? Ethan asked, his voice barely audible above the rain. Sophia looked out at the city, her city, despite everything Robert had tried to take from her. I need to stop running, she whispered, but I don't know how. Lightning split the sky again, and in its brief illumination, something shifted between them. They were no longer strangers sharing a room, but survivors sharing their scars. The rain continued to fall, but up here, above the city that had wounded them both, it felt less like a storm and more like a cleansing. The walk back to their room was silent, their wet clothes leaving trails on the hotel's carpet. Sophia's arms were wrapped tightly around herself, less from cold than from the vulnerability of having shared so much. Ethan walked slightly behind her, his usual commanding presence softened by rain and confession. When they reached their door, both hesitated. The room that had felt too small hours ago now seemed to hold a different kind of tension, not the wariness of strangers, but the awkward intimacy of people who had seen too much of each other's souls too quickly. "You should change first," Ethan said, his voice still carrying traces of their rooftop rawness. "And I can wait out here." Sophia wanted to tell him it wasn't necessary, that she wasn't afraid of him anymore, but old habits died hard. She nodded and slipped inside, grateful for the moment alone to collect herself. In the bathroom, she peeled off her wet clothes and pulled on dry ones, her movements automatic as her mind replayed their conversation. She told him things she'd never told anyone, not her therapist, not the domestic violence counselor she'd spoken to briefly before fleeing. Why him? Why tonight? When she emerged, Ethan was standing by the window again, his wet shirt clinging to his shoulders. He'd removed his tie, and without it, he looked less like a CEO and more like the boy who'd tried to protect his brother from a father's crushing expectations. "Your turn," she said softly. He gathered his things without meeting her eyes, disappearing into the bathroom. Sophia sat on her bed, pulling out her laptop more from habit than intention. The screen lit up to her photos, the broken things she'd been documenting. But now they seemed to tell a different story, not just about damage, but about the courage it takes to remain soft in a hard world. Her phone buzzed and her heart stopped. But it was just a weather alert, more storms expected through the night. She released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The bathroom door opened, and Ethan emerged in a plain white t-shirt and dark sweatpants. The transformation was startling. Without his corporate armor, he looked almost vulnerable. Her photographer's eye noticed things she'd missed before, the slight slump in his shoulders, the worry lines around his eyes, the way his hands seemed unsure without papers to sign or phones to answer. "I should call the airline," he said, reaching for his phone. "Check about tomorrow's flights." "Don't!" The words surprised them both. Sophia closed her laptop, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. You should call your brother instead." Ethan's hand froze over his phone. "Sophia, you know I'm right." She softened her voice. "What you said on the roof about me being stronger than I think. Maybe you need to hear that too." He sank into the room's armchair, running a hand through his damp hair. "What would I even say?" "Hey, Adam. Sorry I've been lying to you for 5 years while secretly watching your art shows like some kind of corporate stalker." Despite everything, Sophia felt a smile tug at her lips. "Maybe start with, 'I miss you.'" Their eyes met across the room, and something shifted in the air between them. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. They were both so used to running, she from Robert's violence, he from his father's legacy, that they'd forgotten how to stand still. "What about you?" he asked quietly. "What's your next move?" Sophia's fingers found her camera bag, touching it like a talisman. "I have a meeting tomorrow. A magazine editor saw my work online. It could be—" She swallowed hard. "It could be my way out, real assignments, legitimate clients, a chance to rebuild." In Chicago, the question carried weight, they both felt. Chicago was Robert's territory, his banks, his charity galas, his carefully maintained web of influence, but it was also her home, her city, the subject of her best work. "I'm tired of letting him take things from me," she said finally. "My home, my career, my sense of safety. When does it end?" Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You have evidence," you said. "Financial records." "Don't!" She stood up abruptly. Don't try to fix this. That's not what tonight was about. Then what was it about? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibilities neither was ready to acknowledge. Sophia moved to the window, watching lightning illuminate the city in stuttering snapshots. It was about truth, she said finally, about seeing each other clearly, just for a moment. No masks, no walls, just, she gestured vaguely at the space between them. This? Ethan stood, moving to join her at the window but maintaining that careful distance. And tomorrow, we go back to our lives. She turned to face him, but maybe a little braver than before, maybe a little more honest. He nodded slowly, understanding what she wasn't saying. Their connection, whatever it was, existed in this suspended moment, this storm-created bubble of midnight confessions and shared pain. Tomorrow would bring reality crashing back. His empire, her survival, the complications they'd both tried to outrun. "I'll call Adam," he said quietly. "Not tonight, but soon. And I'll go to that meeting," she replied, "even though it terrifies me." They stood together at the window, watching the storm rage on. The space between them felt different now, no longer a boundary but a bridge, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let someone see your scars and trust them not to make them deeper. 2:13 a.m. glowed on the nightstand clock when Sophia's phone lit up with a text. She'd been drifting in and out of consciousness, listening to the storm and Ethan's steady breathing from the other bed. The message preview made her blood run cold. "You really thought changing your number would be enough. I miss you, darling." Her sharp intake of breath must have been audible because Ethan stirred. "Everything okay?" His voice was rough with almost sleep. "He found my new number." Sophia's hands shook as she deleted the message. "I don't know how, but he—" Another text arrived. "The purple dress you wore to the Phillips charity gala always was my favorite. You looked stunning last week." Sophia shot up in bed. "Oh, God." Ethan was fully awake now, sitting up. "What is it?" "He's having me followed." Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "I wore that dress last Tuesday at a charity event. I thought I was so careful. I needed the networking for my photography, but I thought I'd timed it perfectly. Knew he'd be at his lake house that day." "Sophia." Ethan's voice cut through her rising panic. "Breathe. Tell me what you need." She forced herself to take deep breaths, grounding herself in the present moment. The hotel room, the storm, Ethan's steady presence. "I need to check something." Moving to her laptop, she pulled up a private Instagram account she used to monitor Robert's movements. Her hands froze over the keyboard. "What?" Ethan had moved closer, maintaining a respectful distance, but close enough to offer support. "He's in Chicago." She turned the screen to show him. A photo from earlier that evening of Robert at a downtown restaurant. Caption time-stamped just hours ago. "He's supposed to be in Michigan until next week." Ethan studied the photo, his expression hardening. "Do you think he knows you're here?" "I don't." Another text interrupted her. "The Greystone has excellent room service, doesn't it?" The phone slipped from her trembling fingers. Ethan caught it before it hit the floor, reading the message. His CEO mask slammed back into place, all traces of sleep gone. "We're leaving," he said, already moving to gather their things. "Now." "No." Sophia forced herself to think clearly. "That's what he wants. He's trying to scare me into running, making mistakes." She took her phone back from Ethan, typing quickly. "Leave me alone, Robert. I have copies of everything." "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, pausing in his movement. "Reminding him why he hasn't come after me directly yet." She showed him her screen. "The financial records I took. They show years of tax evasion, money laundering through his charities. If anything happens to me, they go public." Ethan's expression shifted from concern to something like admiration. "That's why you haven't gone to the police. You're not just running, you're maintaining a stalemate. The police are useless against men like Robert. Money buys too many friends." Sophia hugged her knees to her chest, trying to stop shaking. "But reputation, that's everything to him. As long as I have those records, he has to be careful." "Where are the records?" "Scattered. Different cloud servers. safe deposit boxes. Some with a lawyer who doesn't know what they are, just that they go public if I don't check in monthly. She managed a weak smile. I learned from the best how to protect yourself. Ethan sat on the edge of her bed, close but not touching. You're incredible, you know that. The simple praise nearly undid her. After years of Robert's subtle degradation, of being told she was nothing without him, hearing genuine admiration in someone's voice felt like rain after drought. "And I'm terrified," she admitted. "But I'm also angry. He's taken so much from me, my confidence, my peace of mind, years of my life. But he doesn't get to take my future too." "The magazine meeting tomorrow," Ethan said slowly. "You think he found out about that?" Sophia nodded. "It would explain why he's here early. He always hated my photography, said it was a hobby, not a career." She laughed bitterly. "Why's he'd rather see me running scared than succeeding without him." Another text lit up her phone. "Sweet dreams, darling. We'll catch up soon." Ethan's hand clenched into a fist. "Let me help. My security team." "No." Sophia cut him off firmly. "I told you, I don't need another powerful man fighting my battles." She softened her voice. "But would you mind just talking? About anything? Your brother, your work, whatever. I don't want to be alone with my thoughts right now." Understanding crossed his face. He settled more comfortably on the edge of the bed, maintaining that careful distance that somehow felt more intimate than closeness. "Did I ever tell you about the time Adam convinced me to invest in a food truck that only served different types of grilled cheese?" Despite everything, Sophia felt her lips curve into a genuine smile. "No, but I have a feeling this is going to be good." As Ethan's voice filled the room with tales of his brother's creative ventures, Sophia felt her racing heart begin to slow. Robert was out there, yes, moving his pieces, playing his games, but in here, in this strange bubble of storm-enforced intimacy, she wasn't alone. For the first time since she'd run, she felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope. The storm continued to rage outside, but its sound was different now, less threatening, more like nature's own declaration of defiance. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, the meeting, Robert's machinations, the real world crashing back in. But for now, there was just this. Two people finding strength in each other's broken places, while lightning painted shadows on the walls and a powerful man's threats sat unread on a silenced phone. The first hints of dawn were creeping through the window when Ethan finished telling stories about Adam. He'd moved from the edge of Sophia's bed to the armchair, his voice growing softer as the night wore on, but never stopping. She understood what he was doing, using his words as a shield against her fear, keeping her mind from spiraling into darker places. "You're good at that," she said quietly, "using your voice to fill empty spaces. Corporate meetings taught me how to talk without saying anything." He gave her a tired half-smile. "Adam was always the opposite. He'd say everything in a single sentence, usually one that made everyone uncomfortable with its honesty. You miss that about him." "It wasn't a question. I miss everything about him." Ethan checked his phone, still turned off since their rooftop conversation. "Maybe that's why I go to his shows. To remember what honesty looks like." Sophia wrapped her arms around her knees, studying him in the grey pre-dawn light. Without his suit, without his carefully maintained CEO persona, he looked both younger and older. A man caught between who he'd been forced to become and who he might have been. "Your father," she said carefully. "He did to you what Robert tried to do to me, didn't he? Just slower, more subtle." Ethan's hands tightened on the armrests. "My father never raised a hand to me. No, he just raised expectations so high you had to break yourself to meet them." The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I used to draw. Did I tell you that? Not like Adam, I wasn't talented, but I loved it. The freedom of it." He swallowed hard. "The day I made my first million, I bought an expensive sketchbook. It's still empty, sitting in my office drawer." Sophia reached for her camera bag, pulling out a worn leather portfolio. "Here," she said, holding it out to him. "Look at these." He took it carefully, opening to find dozens of photographs, all cityscapes, all taken from high places. "These are incredible." "They're terrible," she corrected. "They're the first photos I took after I started running. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the camera. But they're mine." She moved to sit on the arm of his chair, pointing to one particular image. "See how the focus is all wrong, how the composition's a mess. That's what freedom looks like at first. It's messy, imperfect, real." Ethan looked up at her, their faces close in the dim light. "How do you do it? Stay soft after everything he did to you." "Who says I'm soft?" But she smiled as she said it. "I'm terrified most days, but I'd rather be terrified and free than safe and trapped." She gestured at her portfolio. "These photos, they're my empty sketchbook, but I'm filling mine." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither was ready to name. Then Sophia's phone buzzed again, a new text from Robert. "Don't," Ethan said as she reached for it. "Don't let him into this moment. He's already here," she replied. But she left the phone where it was. "He's been here since the beginning, just like your father's been sitting in that empty chair since we started talking." Ethan stood abruptly, pacing to the window. The sky was lighting up with streaks of pink and orange, the storm finally passing. "I have an idea," he said, turning back to face her. "But you're not going to like it." Sophia felt her guard rising. "I told you, no security teams. No teams. Just me." He held up a hand as she started to protest. "Hear me out. Your magazine meeting. What if I happen to be having breakfast at the same cafe? Not interfering, just present." "Robert's careful. You said he won't risk a scene with witnesses, especially high-profile ones." "You want to be my shadow." Her voice was flat. "I want to be your friend." The words seemed to surprise them both. "And friends don't let friends face monsters alone, whether those monsters are abusive ex-partners or dying fathers." Sophia stood, moving to stand beside him at the window. The city was waking up, streets beginning to fill with early morning traffic. Somewhere out there, Robert was waiting, playing his games. Somewhere else, a magazine editor was preparing for a meeting that could change her life. "One condition," she said finally. "After my meeting, you call Adam. No more watching from the back of galleries. No more protecting him from truths he deserves to know." "Sophia." "No." She turned to face him fully. "That's the deal. You want to help me face my monster? Help me face him as myself. Not as someone's victim, not as someone's property, but as a photographer who's damn good at her job. And in return, you face your truth. You tell Adam everything." The rising sun caught his face, illuminating the battle playing out there, the CEO warring with the brother, the protector struggling with the truth-teller. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said softly. "Deal." Sophia held out her hand, and he took it. The handshake was firm, professional, but their hands lingered a moment too long. In that touch was everything they weren't saying. The fear, the hope, the strange intimacy born in a storm-forced night of confessions. Her phone buzzed again. Without looking at it, she picked it up and turned it off completely. "I should get ready," she said, gathering her camera bag. "I have a portfolio to present and a life to reclaim." Ethan watched her move about the room, her movements more decisive now, more certain. "Sophia," when she turned, he added quietly, "Thank you for showing me what courage looks like." She smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, it reached her eyes. "Thank you for reminding me I had it all along." The sun continued to rise over Chicago, painting the sky in colors of beginning. In a few hours, they would face their respective demons, her Robert, his truth. But for now, there was just this. Two people standing in the light of dawn, choosing to be brave together. The transformation was fascinating to watch. In the elevator down to the lobby, Ethan Carter reconstructed himself piece by piece, straightening his fresh suit jacket, adjusting his tie, smoothing back his hair. The vulnerable man who'd shared stories about his brother vanished behind the mask of the CEO. But now Sophia could see the cost of that mask in the tension around his eyes. She was performing her own transformation, Her camera hung around her neck like armor, her portfolio clutched against her chest. The clothes she'd chosen carefully, professional but forgettable. The kind of outfit that wouldn't draw attention on a Chicago street. Her hair was pulled back severely, makeup minimal, everything designed to make her harder to track in a crowd. "Remember," she said as the elevator approached the lobby, "we don't know each other. You're just another patron at the cafe. I know how to be invisible in plain sight." His voice had shifted too, taking on that authoritative edge she'd first heard yesterday. "I've been doing it at Adams Galleries for years." The elevator doors opened, and they stepped out separately. Dorothy was at the front desk, and her eyes widened slightly, seeing them together, but she said nothing. Sophia wondered what she thought, what story she'd constructed about the odd pair who'd shared a room during the storm. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean after the rain. Water still dripped from awnings, and puddles reflected the brightening sky. On another morning, it would have been perfect for photography, the city washing away its shadows, emerging renewed. "Miss Brooks," the voice stopped her heart, but it was just the hotel valet, holding out her camera bag that she'd almost forgotten in her hurry. Behind her, she heard Ethan accepting his car from another valet, maintaining their careful charade of being strangers. The cafe was 3 blocks away. Sophia walked them slowly, photographing random scenes as she went, her usual cover for scanning her surroundings. Every suited man made her pulse quicken. Every town car could be Robert's. Her phone stayed off. She'd chosen that power, to disconnect, to refuse his digital intrusion into her morning. But the silence felt dangerous too. What messages was she missing? What moves was he making? The cafe, when she reached it, was already busy with morning commuters. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of Ethan being seated at a corner table, his laptop open like any other businessman having a breakfast meeting. He didn't look at her, but she felt safer knowing he was there. Sophia Brooks, a woman in her 50s, approached, elegant in a way that spoke of artistic authority rather than social pretense. "I'm Claire Bennett from Urban Light magazine. Shall we?" She gestured to a table by the window. Sophia's heart sank. The window seat would make her visible from the street, but refusing would seem suspicious, unprofessional. She forced a smile and sat, positioning herself to keep the street in her peripheral vision. "I've been following your work," Claire said, ordering coffee for them both, "particularly your series on urban renewal. There's something raw about your perspective. You capture both the destruction and the resilience." "That's what interests me," Sophia replied, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "How cities, like people, carry their scars but keep building anyway." She opened her portfolio, laying out her best pieces. Claire leaned forward, genuinely engaged. They discussed composition, lighting, the stories behind certain shots. For a few precious minutes, Sophia felt like herself again, just a photographer talking about her work, not a woman hiding from her past. Then she saw him. Robert wasn't on the street, but in a car parked across the intersection. Even at this distance, she could make out his profile as he spoke on his phone. He hadn't seen her yet, but he was waiting, hunting. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to the next photo in her portfolio. In her peripheral vision, she saw Ethan shift in his seat, his posture alerting her that he'd spotted Robert too. "Don't react," she told herself. "Don't give him the satisfaction." "This series," Claire was saying, pointing to Sophia's photos of the Chicago shoreline, "it's exactly what we're looking for. The way you capture the interaction between the natural and urban elements." A text appeared on Claire's phone, face up on the table. Sophia's blood ran cold as she caught the sender's name, Robert Maxwell. Claire glanced at it, frowned slightly, then turned the phone face down. "As I was saying," Claire continued smoothly, "we'd like to commission you for a 6-month series. Full creative control, proper budget, your work featured in both print and our online platform." It was everything Sophia had dreamed of, a real chance to rebuild her career, to reclaim her art. But Robert's presence across the street felt like a dark cloud threatening to swallow her whole. How had he gotten to Claire? What lies had he told? "Miss Bennet," she said carefully, "may I ask why you really wanted to meet me?" Claire sat back, studying her with sharp eyes. "Because you're talented, Miss Brooks, and because when Robert Maxwell called to warn me against hiring you, claiming you were unstable and untrustworthy, it only made me more interested in your work." She smiled, steel beneath the elegance. "I've been in this industry 30 years. I know men like him, and I know what it costs women to escape them." Sophia felt tears threatening, but forced them back. Across the cafe, she sensed rather than saw Ethan listening, his presence a quiet support. "The job is yours," Claire continued, "if you want it. No strings, no compromises, just your vision, your voice." Robert's car door opened. Sophia watched him step out, adjusting his expensive suit. He hadn't seen her yet, but he was moving toward the cafe with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was hunting. It was time to decide, would she run again, or would she finally stand her ground? The bell above the cafe door chimed, and Sophia felt the temperature in the room drop. Robert's presence had always been like that, consuming the oxygen, changing the atmospheric pressure. He paused in the doorway, rainwater dripping from his expensive umbrella, his eyes scanning the room with practiced casualness. "Take your time with the decision," Claire was saying, her voice pitched slightly louder than necessary. "We want you to be sure this is the right fit." Sophia recognized what the older woman was doing, giving her space to retreat, to avoid confrontation. But she thought of her photographs of broken things healing, of Ethan's empty sketchbook, of all the pieces of herself she'd left behind while running. Actually," Sophia said, her voice clear and steady, "I'd like to accept the position now." She felt, rather than saw, Ethan shift in his peripheral vision, his laptop forgotten as he watched the scene unfold. Robert was moving through the cafe now, his path deliberate but unhurried. "Wonderful," Claire smiled, pulling out a contract. Let's make it official." "Hello, darling." Robert's voice hadn't changed, that same smooth, cultured tone that had once made her feel special, protected. Now it just made her skin crawl. He stood at their table, perfectly groomed in his tailored suit, smiling down at them, as if this was a charming coincidence. "Mr. Maxwell," Claire said coolly, "this is a private meeting." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of interrupting." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "And I just wanted to congratulate my dear Sophia on her new opportunity, although," he leaned down, his cologne overwhelming, "we both know how your last professional venture ended, don't we? 3 years ago, those words would have shattered her. Even 6 months ago, they would have sent her running. But something had changed during the storm-swept night, during those hours of sharing scars with a stranger who'd shown her what real strength looked like." "You mean when you sabotaged my gallery showing?" Sophia's voice was calm as she signed Claire's contract. "Or when you convinced my clients I was unreliable? Which professional venture are we discussing, Robert?" His smile flickered. Around them, other patrons were beginning to notice the tension, conversations quieting. "You're making a scene," he said softly, menace creeping into his tone. "Let's discuss this somewhere private." "No." Sophia stood, making herself his height. "We're done having private discussions, done with quiet threats and midnight texts. I'm not yours to control anymore." "Careful, darling." He reached for her arm, but she stepped back. "You don't want me to release those photos, do you? The ones from that night at the lake house. What would potential employers think?" "You mean the photos you took after you pushed me down the stairs?" Her voice carried through the now silent cafe. "Release them. Show everyone exactly who you are." Robert's facade cracked, ugly rage bleeding through. "You ungrateful little—" "Step back." Ethan's voice cut through the tension. He'd risen from his table, every inch the CEO, even as he kept his distance, respecting Sophia's fight. "There are dozens of witnesses here, Mr. Maxwell. 27 phones recording this interaction. Are you sure this is how you want to play it?" Robert's head snapped toward him, recognition dawning. "Carter, what are you—" His eyes narrowed, darting between them. "Ah, I see you've found yourself a new protector. How disappointing, Sophia. I thought you were smarter than that. He's not my protector, Sophia said firmly. He's my witness. Like everyone else in this cafe, like Claire, who's been recording this entire interaction for her magazine's documentary on workplace harassment. Claire smiled coldly. Her phone indeed held up and recording. The series launches next month. I'm sure your board of directors will find it fascinating viewing. Robert's composure slipped further. You think you can threaten me? I'll destroy you. All of you. I have resources, and I have evidence. Sophia pulled out a USB drive. Everything, Robert. The tax fraud, the money laundering, the offshore accounts. One copy here, dozens more set to release if anything happens to me. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. I learned from you, after all, about power, about leverage, about making people afraid. You wouldn't dare. Try me. She met his gaze steadily. I'm not running anymore. This is my city too, and I'm done letting you take things from me. For a moment, she saw the truth in his eyes. He'd never really seen her before. Not her strength, not her resilience, not her capacity for strategic thinking. He'd been so busy trying to break her that he hadn't noticed her learning to rebuild herself, stronger than before. This isn't over, he snarled, but he was already backing away. Yes, it is. Sophia's voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the silent cafe. Goodbye, Robert. He fled. There was no other word for it. The bell chimed again as the door slammed behind him, and suddenly Sophia could breathe again. Her hands were shaking, but her spine was steel. Claire stood, gathering the signed contract. Well, that was quite the show. Though I was actually serious about the documentary series, if you're interested. Sophia laughed, the sound surprised and a little wild. Let me get through the architecture series first. As the cafe's normal buzz of conversation resumed, Sophia finally allowed herself to look at Ethan. He was still standing, watching her with an expression of profound respect and something deeper, something neither of them was ready to name. Thank you, she mouthed silently. He shook his head slightly, and she understood. She'd done this herself. He'd just been there to witness her strength, exactly as she'd asked. Sophia sat back down, her camera secure around her neck, her signed contract in front of her, her future suddenly wide open. Outside, the morning sun broke through the last of the storm clouds, painting the wet Chicago streets in colors of possibility. After Claire left with the signed contract, Sophia remained at her table, hands wrapped around a fresh cup of coffee, watching the morning light play on the puddles outside. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her drained but oddly peaceful. She'd stood her ground, she'd faced her monster, and she'd won. Ethan approached her table, coffee in hand. Mind if I join you now that we can drop the stranger act? She gestured to the empty chair, studying him openly for the first time in public. He'd put his CEO armor back on, the perfect suit, the authoritative posture. But she could see the cracks in it now, the places where the real man showed through. So, he said, settling into the chair, how does it feel? Terrifying. She smiled. Exhilarating. Like jumping off a building and realizing I can fly. She traced the rim of her cup. I kept waiting for the old fear to take over, for my voice to shake, or my courage to fail. But then I thought about what you said last night, about being soft after everything. And I realized being soft isn't the opposite of being strong. All those broken things in my photographs, they're soft enough to be damaged, but strong enough to survive, to grow through the cracks. Ethan was quiet for a moment, watching the cafe return to its normal morning rhythm. You were magnificent, he said finally. I wish Adam could have seen it. He always said art was about telling the truth, even when it scares you. Sophia heard the longing in his voice. Speaking of truth-telling, he pulled out his phone, still turned off since their rooftop conversation. I know. I made a deal. His fingers hovered over the power button. What if he hates me? What if protecting him was the wrong choice? What if it wasn't about protection at all? Sophia asked gently. What if it was about control, your way of keeping one piece of your life safe from your father's influence? The words hit home. She saw it in the way his shoulders tensed, then released. "You're getting dangerously good at seeing through me, Ms. Brooks. Professional hazard. Photographers have to see what's really there, not just what people want us to see." Ethan turned on his phone. Messages immediately began flooding in. Work emergencies, meeting notifications, his father's lawyers still trying to reach him. But he ignored them all, scrolling through his contacts until he found Adam's number. "I did something else last night," he admitted, finger hovering over the call button. "While you were in the bathroom, I bought 2 tickets to his gallery opening next month." 2. His eyes met hers, vulnerable despite his corporate armor. "I thought maybe you'd want to photograph it. Urban renewal, broken things healing. Seems like your kind of subject matter." The invitation hung between them, weighted with possibilities neither was ready to name. They'd shared one storm-swept night, witnessed each other's battles, seen each other's scars. But moving forward, into whatever this was becoming, would require its own kind of courage. "First things first," Sophia said, nodding at his phone. "Call your brother." Ethan took a deep breath and pressed the call button. It rang twice before a sleepy voice answered. "Hello? Adam?" Ethan's voice cracked slightly. It's me. I'm sorry it's so early. I needed to tell you something." Sophia stood quietly, gathering her things. This conversation wasn't for her to witness, but Ethan caught her wrist gently, eyes pleading for her to stay. She sat back down, understanding. He'd been her witness. Now she would be his. "Ethan!" Adam sounded more awake now, confusion and hope warring in his voice. Are you okay?" "No," Ethan said honestly. "I'm not. I haven't been okay for a long time, and I need to tell you why." He swallowed hard. "It's about Dad, and the company, and all the things I've been hiding from you." Sophia watched as he began to tell his truth, stripped of pretense and protection. His hand trembled slightly on the table, and without thinking, she covered it with her own. He gripped her fingers like a lifeline as he spoke about their father's manipulation, the weight of the company, the years of secret gallery visits. Outside, the sun had fully risen, turning the wet Chicago streets into mirrors of light. Through the cafe window, Sophia could see people hurrying to work, carrying their own stories of fear and courage, of running and standing ground. She thought about the magazine contract in her bag, the new series she would create, the truth she would tell through her lens. Robert was still out there, nursing his wounds, perhaps plotting revenge. Ethan's father was still dying, his empire still demanding attention. There would be more battles, more storms to weather, but something had shifted during their shared night of confession and their morning of confrontation. They'd each found something in the other. Not a savior or a protector, but a witness, someone to stand beside them as they faced their own monsters, fought their own battles. Sophia lifted her camera, capturing the moment. Morning light streaming through rain-washed windows. A man telling his truth into a phone. Their hands joined on a cafe table that had become an unlikely battlefield and sanctuary both. Another broken thing healing, another story of renewal to tell. By mid-morning, reality began creeping back in. Ethan's phone buzzed constantly with business emergencies, while Sophia's inbox filled with preliminary assignments from Claire. They'd moved from the cafe to a quiet park nearby, neither quite ready to end whatever this was between them. "He cried," Ethan said suddenly, breaking their comfortable silence. They sat on a bench overlooking a small fountain, its water catching the late morning sun. "Adam, when I told him everything, not because he was angry, but because he said he'd been waiting 5 years to hear my voice." Sophia adjusted her camera settings, capturing the way light fractured through the fountain spray. "And the gallery show. He wants me to come early, help set up, said we have 5 years of stories to catch up on." Ethan loosened his tie slightly, a gesture that seemed more about shedding his CEO persona than physical comfort. "He asked about you, actually." "Me?" Sophia lowered her camera. "I told him about last night, about watching someone face their fears with more courage than I've shown in years." He turned to look at her directly. He said anyone who could make his coward of a big brother finally tell the truth was someone he needed to meet. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Sophia focused on her camera screen, reviewing the morning's photos, the cafe where she'd faced Robert, the street where she'd stopped running, this moment of quiet aftermath. "I start the magazine assignment next week," she said carefully. 6 months documenting Chicago's hidden spaces, places where the city's past and future collide. "Sounds perfect for you." "It is," she smiled, remembering Claire's fierce support. "They're even providing a panic button and security detail for location shoots. Claire thinks of everything." "Smart woman." Ethan paused, then added quietly, "Robert won't stop entirely. Men like him don't handle humiliation well." "I know, but I'm done letting that fear control my choices." Sophia's fingers found the USB drive in her pocket, her insurance policy, her power. "Besides, I've learned a few things about handling men who think they own the world." Ethan's phone buzzed again, his father's lawyers, still persistent. This time, he answered, "Yes, I'll be there for the reading." "No, I'm bringing my brother." "Yes, I understand what that means for the company structure." He ended the call, looking drained but resolute. "That's going to be a nightmare. But you'll face it together now," Sophia reminded him. "You and Adam." "Yeah." He smiled slightly. "Though I might need my own photographer to document the corporate carnage that follows." The offer in his voice was subtle but clear. Sophia considered it, watching sunlight play across his face. Last night, in the storm-enforced intimacy of their shared room, everything had seemed possible. But now, in the clear light of day, she recognized the danger of trading one man's influence for another's, no matter how well-intentioned. "I need to stand on my own for a while," she said finally. "Build something that's completely mine." "I know." His voice held understanding rather than disappointment. "That's why—" He pulled an envelope from his jacket. "This is the deed to a small studio space in Logan Square. Good security, great natural light. The lease is paid for 6 months." "Ethan, it's not a gift," he interrupted. "It's an investment. When you're ready to show your work again, when you've built your name on your own terms, I want first rights to display your Chicago series in the Carter Industries lobby." Sophia studied the envelope, understanding what he was really offering. Not charity or protection, but partnership. A business arrangement between equals, each bringing their own strength to the table. 6 months, she said thoughtfully. "That's when Adam's show opens in New York." "It is." Ethan's eyes held hers. "Plenty of time for you to document the city's renewal. Plenty of time for me to learn how to be a brother again instead of a protector. And after that, he smiled, gesturing at her camera. "I will have to see what develops." The morning crowd flowed around their bench, business people rushing to meetings, tourists studying maps, artists setting up their street displays. Chicago was awakening fully, claiming the day. Somewhere in his expensive office, Robert was probably plotting his next move. Somewhere in his hospital room, Ethan's father was counting his remaining days. The world hadn't stopped spinning because 2 strangers had shared a storm-swept night of honesty, but something had shifted, like the city itself after the rain, washed clean, ready for new growth. Sophia lifted her camera one more time, framing Ethan against the fountain's spray, catching the exact moment when sunlight turned the water drops into diamonds. "One condition," she said, lowering the camera. "Indeed, the studio has to have a drawing table." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "For your sketchbook," she explained. "The empty one in your office drawer. Maybe it's time we both stopped running from the art we left behind." His phone buzzed again. Another crisis, another demand. But for the first time since she'd met him, Ethan Carter let it ring, choosing instead to sit in the morning sun with a photographer who had taught him that sometimes the bravest art comes from broken places. 6 months later, another storm was rolling into Chicago. Sophia stood at the window of her Logan Square studio, watching lightning illuminate the skyline she'd spent months documenting. Her new exhibition was ready, photos lining the walls, telling stories of urban renewal, of healing, of transformation. The security system beeped as someone entered the code. She didn't turn, recognizing the familiar footsteps. "Your flight's going to be delayed," she said, still watching the storm. "Just like the night we met." "Actually," Ethan's voice carried a smile, "I planned for that, booked an earlier one." Now she did turn. He stood in her studio doorway, looking both different and exactly the same. The expensive suit was still there, but he wore it more comfortably now, like a choice rather than armor. A leather portfolio was tucked under his arm. His no longer empty sketchbook. "Ready for New York?" she asked. "Adam's handling the pre-show jitters by stress baking. Apparently, I'm now the proud brother of Chicago's most innovative artist, pastry chef." His expression softened. "He's excited to meet you, you know. Says anyone who can capture broken things becoming beautiful must be worth knowing." Sophia smiled, turning back to her photos. The past 6 months played through her mind. Robert's attempts at retaliation, thwarted by her evidence and Claire's public support. The slow process of reclaiming her art, her confidence, her city. The careful dance she and Ethan had maintained. Professional texts about her Carter Industries commission evolving into shared coffee breaks. Then longer conversations about healing and art and truth. "I have something for you," she said, moving to her desk. "Before you go." She handed him a photograph, one she'd taken that first morning after their confrontation. It showed his reflection in the cafe window, overlaid with the rising sun and scattered raindrops. In it, he looked simultaneously powerful and vulnerable, caught between who he'd been and who he was becoming. "For Adam's show," she explained, "a reminder of the morning his brother chose truth over protection." Ethan studied the photo, understanding its significance. "And what about you? Any regrets about not running that night?" "Only that I ran for so long before it." She gestured at her exhibition. "Look what happened when I finally stood still." Her photos told Chicago's story, but they also told hers, a broken church transformed into a community center, an abandoned factory becoming an art school, a storm-damaged garden blooming again. Each image captured something she'd learned during those long months of healing. That damage doesn't have to be permanent, that renewal requires both strength and softness, that some things have to break before they can become something new. "Claire called," she said, watching lightning flash outside. "The magazine series is being nominated for a national award. She wants me to head their new documentary photography department." "Sophia, that's wonderful." His pride was genuine, untainted by any need to protect or control. "I said yes, but with conditions. I keep my independent projects. My studio stays here." She paused, then added quietly, "My life stays here." The weight of that choice hung between them. 6 months ago, they'd been strangers sharing a storm-forced confession. Now they were something else. Something neither had rushed to define, both understanding the value of slow healing, of earned trust. "I've been thinking about that night," Ethan said, moving to stand beside her at the window. "About what you said about filling empty spaces." "And?" He opened his portfolio, showing her his recent sketches, rough, emotional drawings that would never hang in a corporate boardroom. "I'm stepping down as CEO. The board's announcing it next week. Adam and I are converting part of the company into a foundation for arts education and domestic violence prevention." "Your father would hate that," Sophia observed. "Yes," Ethan smiled slightly. "He made that very clear at the will reading. But I'm not that scared little boy anymore, trying to earn his approval through quarterly profits." Thunder rolled overhead, and Sophia felt an echo of that first night, the way fear and honesty had cracked them both open, letting light into places that had been dark for too long. "I have a confession," she said. "I'm terrified about New York, about meeting Adam, seeing your world, being somewhere Robert might find me." "I know." Ethan's voice was gentle. "That's why it matters that you're choosing to go anyway." She turned to face him fully. "One condition. Name it. When we get back, you let me photograph you drawing. For my next series. about people finding their way back to abandoned dreams. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw everything they'd become to each other. Witnesses, partners, fellow artists learning to create something new from their broken pieces. "Deal," he said softly. Outside, the storm intensified, but neither of them moved to leave. They stood together at the window, watching lightning illuminate the city that had forced them together and taught them both how to stay. Tomorrow would bring New York, Adams Gallery, new challenges to face. But for now, there was just this: two people who had learned that the deepest healing happens when you find someone willing to witness your storms without trying to shelter you from the rain. Sophia lifted her camera one last time, capturing their reflections in the storm-dark glass, not running, not hiding, just standing together in the light of all they'd become. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.